Blender for Noobs.
Hello, this is Dan Nobles and welcome to Blender for Noobs and welcome to this video on learning Blender in under an hour. Your fast track guide to get up and running with Blender. Now, will this under an hour video tutorial teach you everything that you need to know about Blender? Of course not. You would need to take many tutorials to learn everything that there is about Blender and you still wouldn't get done. What I am going to attempt to do with this tutorial is to get you quickly up and running, those of you who are just starting out with Blender, or you may have been using a different 3D package and you want to try Blender out. This will get you a quick start guide on Blender, the Blender interface, and the main details about it. So as you can see from the splash screen right here, I am using Blender 2.73a. It's the latest official install at the time of this video. Now I'm not going to go over installing Blender. You can go to blender.org. It's pretty straightforward to install, but I will give you a link in the description on how to install. I have a different tutorial for that if you need it. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. You'll notice in the bottom left here, I have a picture of a mouse here. This is called screencast keys, and whenever I hit a button on my keyboard, you'll see it over here. You'll also see the left and right mouse clicks as well. Okay, so once you install Blender and you open it up and you see the screen, this is pretty much exactly what you see the first time you start Blender. If you're like me, you look at this and you say, okay, this is interesting, but what the heck are all these menus that I'm looking at? What do they do? How do I get started? Well, the reason for this video is I'm going to demystify Blender for you. If you're new to it, I'm going to take a lot of the mystery out of it to help you get up and running with it. So my philosophy in learning a new program, or when I'm teaching these programs, my thought is you can watch this tutorial, but don't worry about taking every single thing that I'm saying in. Don't worry about trying to commit it to memory. But the important thing is to know what is possible in Blender and catch the key points. So later on, when you think about it, you can think, oh yeah, I remember that guy said that if I go over here and change the setting, it'll do this. So, just watch out for the things that are of interest to you. And that's an easy way to know, okay, I know that's possible in Blender. So then you can go and look it up later on if you need to. And in fact, I'm always looking up things myself, because when I'm doing something and I need to do something in my modeling, I think, wow, I know that was done before somewhere. I did that before. Sometimes I'll look at my own tutorials just to remember how I did it. And sometimes I have to go look at other tutorials. There is a lot of information, a lot of good information, a lot of good tutorials out there for Blender. And that is a great thing. Blender is just, a great open source program with all these capabilities. You have modeling, you have animation, you have camera tracking, you have a game engine, compositing, it's just packed full of useful things in a program. And it's very lightweight as far as, running. It doesn't require a supercomputer to run. Of course, it's best if you have a good graphics card, and that will help you when you go to render out your final images or final animations. So let's go ahead and take a look at what is Blender 3D. As you see in the middle, by default, you'll see this cube here. That's your default cube that comes up, and this whole view is your 3D viewport. Over to the left, we have a tool shelf. Up at the top, we have an info menu. Over on the right, we have two menus over here. And at the bottom, we also have a timeline menu. This is the default setup when you first open up Blender. So we're going to go through all of these to get an idea of what this is, what it means, and what you need to do to change them if you want to. And you can customize Blender ad infinitum. You can customize it however you want to. I'll show you how to do that, but I'm going to caution you along the way on what you maybe want to leave alone and maybe what you want to change. So to start out with this tool shelf here, I'm going to hit T and toggle that out of the way. It's a toggle menu. So as you hit T, it just toggles on and off. And I'm going to start up at the top here. You'll notice that we have this little thing here, and if you click on it, we have a number of editor types here. And I'm going to go over briefly go over all these editor types, but I just want you to know that each one of these windows is basically just an editor type. So you can change it around to whichever editor type you want to. By default, they're set a certain way, but it doesn't have to be that way. So for example, over here are the properties, and that's this down here. But if I come down here to my 3D view, I can say, well, I really want the properties here. So I just change it that way. Now it's stretched out because the whole window is stretched out, but it's the same thing. So I'm going to change this back to the 3D view. But just to let you know that you can customize each one of these windows. No problem whatsoever. So let's start with this first one. This little blue eye here is called the info window here, or info editor. And the interesting thing about the info window is you see the file render window, help, and all this good stuff here, but you're not seeing the whole thing. It's kind of hidden. So if you go down to the bottom of that where you get the double arrow, you can take your mouse and drag that down and you will see some information in there. And what this is this is sort of the real-time programming that's going by in Blender. And I can tell you that I hardly ever use this information. The only time I've used this is if I'm doing something in Blender, maybe I'm exporting a file into a different format or something, and something's going wrong, I'm getting an error. I might pull this down and look at the error message and see if it's anything that I can understand myself, or maybe I can Google and try to figure out what's going on. But other than that, I take the double arrows and I push it right back up. But just be aware that the info menu, that's where you see that information there. So let's look at the info menu. We got our file. Now you normally, if you're familiar with Windows programs, you have your, file new, file save, and all that good stuff. We also have user preferences. We have a save startup file, load factory settings. These are all important because user preferences is sort of like the options in Blender. They give you a whole nother screen of the internal system options in Blender. And we're going to be looking at that also in a second. We also have a save startup file. As we go along, we're going to be saving our startup file. And so the next time you open Blender, you'll have all the preferences set the way that you want it in your startup file. And of course, the load factory settings. If you get discouraged and you say, I didn't want my startup file that way, I've changed everything and I want it back the way it was, then you can choose load factory settings, and that'll throw everything right back the way it was when you first opened Blender. And when I say back the way it was, I mean exactly like it is right now. So if you hit that, if you choose to do that, it's going to be, right like it came out of the box. We also have a render menu. Now, to be honest, I never use this menu. I use the shortcut keys. So it's not really one of those necessary menus, but it's there if you need it. We have a window menu. I never use that. We have a help menu, and that's where you can go through here. There's some help items here. There's also the splash screen, which shows you what version of Blender that you're using. Now, also along here, we have some settings. This item right here is your screen layout. And if you drop this down, click on this, you'll see that they have some built-in predefined screen layouts for you. So in other words, if you were in the default view, and let's say that you created a model and you wanted to animate it, you could jump over to the animation and it will give you a bunch of the windows that pertain to the animation. You can also jump over to something like video editing. You'll have the screens that have to do with video editing. Blender has a actually pretty powerful video editing tool built in, or something like compositing, where you have the windows that are more apt to be used while you're compositing. Now, you have these presets, but you can say, well, these are nice, but I want my own. And you can hit this plus mark. This plus and the X are common in Blender. You'll see them on many of the menu items that you see here. But if you change your windows around and you say, okay, I want to call this something different, or maybe even make a new compositing, you can choose plus and you can rename this to whatever you want it to. So I'm going to change this back to default. And just for your own information, I don't normally make any new windows like this. I normally work in the default view that I've customized myself. And sometimes I'll jump over to their animation or compositing just because it has some of the common windows, like I said, that I use there. So those are the screen layouts. Next we have scene. So on the scene, by default, you only have this one scene in here. If you drop this down, you only see the one scene. You can create more. And the idea of the scenes, say you've created a model car or something, and you've set it up so that it animates across the road, and you got all the cameras set up and everything, then you could use that and say, well, you know, I want that, but then I also want it in this different road, or it's going a different way, or I have different camera set up, but I don't want to lose what I created here. So you can go ahead and use the plus mark, and you can add a new scene. And that way you can use the assets you created, like the model car and all the stuff you have created already, and just put it in a different scene that you can access right from the same blend file that you're using. So that's scene. Now over here, you'll see the different engines that comes with Blender. So if we drop this down, we have the Blender render, we have the Blender game engine, we have the cycles render engine. Now just to go over these very quickly, the Blender render engine is the default render engine that has been with Blender a very, very, very long time. The Blender render engine is quick. I've seen a lot of really, really great stuff done with it. But in recent years, we have now the cycles render engine that comes with Blender. This is more like a more robust render engine, and I would say now it is the preferred render engine in Blender. What cycles render does for Blender is cycles attempts to show accurate light bounces off of objects. So, or I should say, in the way light reacts with objects as accurately as possible. So with the cycles render engine, it's possible to get a lot more realistic results. You can do a lot with the Blender render engine, but in my opinion, the cycles render is far superior. But in some cases, it depends on what you're trying to do, what you need to render out, and how fast you need to do it. And that leaves us with the Blender game engine. And as I said before, Blender also has the capability of creating games. So this is the engine that is used in order to create games in Blender. So those are the engines, the Blender engines. As we move across, we'll see this is sort of like a status bar. It shows you the version of Blender you're on, the number of vertices in the cube here, the number of faces, number of tries, number of objects in your scene. So we're really looking at a cube, a camera, and a lamp. It shows the number of lamps, the amount of memory used, and your item that is selected. So right now we have the cube selected. It shows up there. If I select the camera, it shows up camera there. Now, just to let you know, as you probably already figured out, by default in Blender, if you right click, that is the selection. I'm going to change that in a minute because I prefer to select with the left. But of course, you'll have the option of leaving it, however you want to, or changing it. Okay, so that's the top info bar. Let's move down the right-hand side of the screen. There's actually two windows here. Like I was showing you before, if I click on this, this is what's called the outliner. So if we go between here and drag this down a little bit, we can kind of see it a little bit better. And I'm also going to drag this out so we can see this a little bit better as well. The outliner is kind of an organizational window, and it shows you what you have in your scene. And you can work with this a little bit as far as, say if we wanted to rename our cube here, we can click on the cube. I could double click in there and I could say, well, this is really a box or something else like that. You can rename things. You can also come over here to the right and you'll see some items here. If I click on this, I can hide it. And by the way, everything that I do here, there's shortcut keys to as well. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So I'm going to unhide that. I can click on this. I can make it so that it's not selectable. So I'll come over here. I can try to select it all day long. I can select the camera, but I can't select that cube. And the reason to do that is if you're working on a complex scene, you may have some objects in there that you don't want to be able to select because they keep getting in the way. I think probably you might even want to hide them. But anyway, you have the option to not be able to select them. So I'm going to turn that back on. And you also have the option of clicking this camera here and turning off the render on whatever object you have selected. So in this case, if I did a render of this scene, instead of seeing this cube, I wouldn't see anything there because I have the render for that object turned off. Now, the reason you might do something like this is, say if you had a scene with let's say if you had a car and you had a mountain in the background and, sky or whatever, and you say, well, I just want the render of the mountain. I don't want the car in the render for this particular render. You can just select the entire car if you have it as one object, and you could turn off the render. So you have some options here in the outliner. You also, like I said, have the possibility of renaming them. And as you create more and more complex models or scenes, it becomes more important to name your objects in a logical manner, so that especially if you share your files, somebody opens it up and they look at what's there, they can easily find where to select something. So that is the outliner. We also have, if we look down here at this next one, this is the properties menu. This is a very important window in Blender. I'm going to say this is one that you don't want to get rid of as far as customization. You pretty much want to keep it here. It doesn't have to be right here. You can put it down on the bottom or wherever you want it to be, but you would want to have this in your basic Blender setup. Now I'm going to come back and I'm going to go over some of these properties in a little bit, but just so you know, as you select different objects in your viewport here, your actual properties can change over. So if I select this lamp, you'll see that we have a lamp setting here. And if I select the camera, we now have a camera setting here. And if I select a 3D object in the scene, you have different options. So it really depends on what you have selected. But I'm going to, like I said, I'm going to go over all these settings in a little bit just so you'll be familiar with them. So moving down towards the bottom, we have a few other windows here. We have our 3D viewport, which we've already kind of looked at. We also have a timeline, and this has to do with animation. And like I say, by default, this shows up in Blender, but we're going to change that in a little bit. But while I'm here, let's go ahead and look at these editor types. And just very briefly, I'm going to go over these so you'll at least be familiar with what we have here. So we know we have the 3D view. That's where you see the cube. That's your basic working window when you're doing modeling, and maybe even some animation to set up your animation and things like that. We have a group of editors here that have to do with animation. You have your timeline, graph editor, dope sheet, NLA editor. All this is kind of lumped together for your animation functions. And then if you go up here, we have more like some, I guess you would call them technical editors. Your UV image editor, you can actually set that to show an image. Like if you're using a reference image to model against something, you can have an image displayed up there. It's also used to work with UVs, which has to do with texturing. You have a video sequence editor, movie clip editor, having to do with video editing. You have a regular text editor, in case you wanted to make some notes or whatever. You also have a node editor. This is very important in Blender, especially if you're using the Cycles render engine, to set up nodes in order to create your different materials and different compositing. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about nodes a little bit later on, and we'll actually get into using them a little bit in this tutorial. And then you have a logic editor, which has more to do if you're into creating games, you'll be using this logic editor. We have the properties, which we already looked at over here on the right. We have the outliner, which we also looked at on the right. We have the user preferences, which I'm going to go into in just a minute. Like I said, these are all the main options in Blender. We have the info, which we looked at on the top here. You also have a file browser, which is sort of like the Windows Explorer. You can search for files, open files, and when you save a file, you'll actually see the file browser come up. You also have a Python console. This has to do with creating scripts to enhance Blender or change the way something functions. So if you're into scripting and development, then you would use this Python console. Okay, so let's go back up to File here. And remember, we have these user preferences here also. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that and bring that up. So you can think of this as the main system options for Blender, how you set up Blender the way that you want it set up. So I'm going to start over with the far left, the interface. As you can see, we have some number of tabs that go across here. So the interface, you can kind of look at this. I can tell you right now that I've never really changed anything here. You may have the need to, and you can kind of take a look at it, but this is basically to do with the interface options. And go over to editing. Again, I haven't really had the need to change anything here. I may have messed around with the auto keyframe a little bit, something like that, but in general, if you see anything here that you need to change, it'll be under editing. And these type of things, for me at least, I don't really mess with these unless I need something to work a certain way. And maybe I've gone on and researched how to do it, and maybe it shows up in editing, and that's why I would come into the editing menu here. So the next is input. Now the only thing that I change here is the select width, and I'm going to change that over to left so that now when I select the cube on my screen, I'm going to select it with the left button on my mouse. And of course, you're free to change it to whatever you need it to be. The other thing that I'm going to mention here is this emulate numpad. Now in Blender, if you want to change views to like the top view, right view, side view, front view, whatever, that is all done on the numbers using your numpad. Now if you're using a laptop, you may not have a numpad. Some of them do, some of them don't, or most of them don't. But if you choose this emulate numpad, you can use the top numbers above your keyboard in order to emulate that numpad. So say for example, if I chose 7 top view, you can hit the 7 on top of your keyboard, and it would do the same thing as the number 7 on a numpad on a regular keyboard. So that's good to keep in mind if you use a laptop. So I'm going to turn that back off right now since I'm not using a laptop. And over here you can see, we click on these, you can see all the different options for the keyboard shortcuts in Blender. For example, you can see the Save Blender file is the Control-S keyboard shortcut. So I'm going to take this opportunity here to talk a little bit about the keyboard shortcuts in Blender, because some people, when they first start up Blender, they complain about, I hate Blender, I don't want to even learn it because of all the keyboard shortcuts that are in Blender. And I can tell you that when I first started learning Blender, I heard the same thing from other people, and it really kind of made me kind of scared, because I'm thinking, I'm not used to doing all these keyboard shortcuts. I thought those were the days of the past. I used to use Unix a long time ago, and all these keyboard shortcuts, and do I really want to do this? Let me take the fear out of the keyboard shortcuts right now. Really, there is a lot of keyboard shortcuts. Just about everything you can do in Blender has a keyboard shortcut, but you don't have to use the keyboard shortcuts. There are menus for just about everything that you can do. But I will say this, in learning Blender and learning a lot of the keyboard shortcuts, it definitely speeds up your process of using Blender, whether you're doing modeling, animation, or other things in Blender that you're doing. You'll definitely want to learn some of the keyboard shortcuts. Now, the good news is, depending on what part of Blender you want to learn, say for example, I'm more into modeling. I do some animation, and I may do some compositing and a few other things in Blender. But when I'm doing my modeling, there are really only a handful of keyboard shortcuts that are the most important that I need to deal with. So depending on what you're learning in Blender, you will only need the keyboard shortcuts relevant to what you're doing. And just to help you out, I've included a kind of my own cheat sheet of keyboard shortcuts, and you can find that in the description. You can print that out and hang it up on your wall or whatever, and it'll give you kind of a cheat sheet as you're learning Blender to kind of speed things up. And you will notice as you continue to work with Blender and use these shortcut keys, they'll become second nature to you, and pretty soon you won't even be thinking about the keyboard shortcuts. You'll just be doing it just like anything else. So don't worry about the keyboard shortcuts. I will recommend that you don't change any of them, because as you take other people's tutorials, they're going to be using the normal keyboard shortcuts that come with Blender. And unless something really conflicts or really bugs the heck out of you, I would say leave them as they are. But as you can see, you can just, again, customize the heck out of Blender. Okay, so next item is the add-ons. Now, because Blender is an open source program and you have developers putting in their own time in order to enhance the functionality of Blender, and by the way, they do a heck of a job. There is also things that are not by default turned on in Blender, but they are included in the install file. So for example, if you come over here and you say, well, I need an import engine for a certain format. So right now, like if you wanted to import, export to 3ds format, that's turned on. But say you wanted the AutoCAD one here, and it is not turned on. Now I don't know what this little warning is. Let's drop this down and see what we can see. Under construction, see wiki for details. So that gives you kind of an idea that it's not like a final product here, but maybe almost like a beta add-on. But say you needed that one, and in order to use it, all you need to do is come over here and click that, and boom, it's turned on. You can close this file and it'll still be turned on. Now, the next time you start Blender, it will be turned off unless you come down here and save user settings. Now, as you can see, there are just tons of different options here. Well, maybe not so much in there, but there's a lot of options here for the added functionality in Blender. But if you're out on the forums and you're researching something that somebody may have created, there may be another add-on that isn't in this list. If that's the case, what you do is you download that add-in and you can install from file right here. Just be aware what you're downloading. Sometimes some of these add-ons might be like you see here. It might be kind of in the beta status. So if you download something, install something here, and your Blender starts crashing for some reason, you may start thinking about, what have I added onto Blender that's not normally there? So these are the add-ons. I'm going to go over here now to themes, and you can customize all the different items here, how they look, what color they are, and all that. You can do it separately, or you can come up here to the presets, drop this down, and you can change it to one of the presets here, and it will change the entire look of Blender. And there's some pretty neat ones here. So you can either create your own, use one of the presets, or say, well, that was interesting when I was using it, but I really want to go back to the default. You can come in here and reset to default theme down here at the bottom, and it will put it back exactly the way it was. Okay, so I'm moving over to File, and this just has the options of the number of save versions, recent files to show, that sort of thing that has to do with your file system. Really the only thing that I've had the need to change in here is I might change the temp location, or I might change the number of save versions, that sort of thing. But basically that's all I change in here. So next up is System. And by default, I normally leave all this stuff alone, but there is one important thing here I want to show you. And if we scroll down here and look at the compute device, this is very important in Blender. If you have the option CUDA here, click that, it probably means that you have a GeForce, an NVIDIA GeForce card. And if you do, I'm going to say go ahead and click on that and make sure that you set it to your GeForce. Because what this does, the compute device is telling Blender what to use in order to render out your images or your animation. So if I choose none, by default it's going to use the processor in your computer, your CPU, and it's going to work okay, but it's going to be kind of slow normally, unless you have a really fast CPU. But the fastest way to do it is to use your NVIDIA card. So I'm going to recommend that if you don't have an NVIDIA card and you're serious about using Blender, then as you move forward with Blender, become more and more serious about it, you'll notice that you're going to want your renders to come out faster, or fast as possible. So especially if you're rendering out some animation that's just taking hours and hours, you're going to find the need to invest in an NVIDIA card that is CUDA compatible. And if you look up on the internet, you can probably find fairly easy what cards are compatible with Blender. So I'm going to leave mine on CUDA there. I'm going to go ahead and choose Save User Settings, and I'm going to close this menu. Okay, let's go ahead and customize the overall look of our screen here. Now, like I said before, you can change it however you want it to be, but I'm going to change it the way I want it to be. If you're happy with that, you can do the same thing, or you can customize it your own way. But basically what I want to do is, first of all, I don't want this animation window in here. So in order to get rid of that, what you do is come down to the bottom of this menu here. You'll get the double arrows, and I'm going to right click on that and choose Join Area. And when I do that and I move the mouse back and forth, you can see the arrows going back and forth. Now, if I pointed the arrow up, it's going to join the animation window into the this 3D view, but I don't want that. I want it to join. I want the 3D view to take over the animation window. So I'm going to click, move down here and click it, and you'll see that it just joined those two together, taking the 3D view as the dominant window here. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to split this window up into three. So what do you do to create windows? Well, you'll notice in the very corner of the window, you'll see these diagonal bars. Just grab that with the mouse and drag it over, and you'll see it splits the window. Now I want to split this right window into two. Do the same thing, come up to the diagonal bars, grab it and just pull it down, and you'll see it splits into two that way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this the top, the front, and the side view. So while the mouse is in this window, I'm going to choose 7 on my numpad, and you'll see that makes it the top. Come over here, I'm going to choose 1 on my numpad, that makes it the front. And I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to choose 3 on my numpad, and that makes it the right view. So this is kind of the basic default setup that I like to use. And you'll notice by default, they're all in the perspective view. I don't like to work in this perspective view. I like to work in orthographic. So if you choose 5 on the numpad, it toggles between perspective and orthographic. So I got orthographic here. Come over here, choose 5, front ortho. Come down here, choose 5, right ortho. Okay, and I've just made kind of a major customization to the look that I want. So I'm going to come over here to File, and I'm going to choose Save Startup File, and it shows you the keyboard shortcut Control U. You can do it either way. Just going to choose that, and it says, is it okay? Yes, I'm going to click on that. It's okay. So now the next time I start Blender, this is exactly what it's going to look like when it comes up. Now, as you're working in these windows, I normally use this left window as my main working area, and say that you're working on something and you want to be able to work on it in full screen. Well, if you do a Control Up arrow, it brings it up to the full screen. And again, that's a toggle type of thing, Control Up arrow. Now, when you're in here in your full screen mode here like this, there is another keyboard shortcut that this is sort of like a secret in Blender. Not many people know about this, but you can do a Control Alt Q, and that will automatically give you a 4-window view. I think this is sort of like mimicking, I don't know, it might be mimicking 3DS or Maya, one of those that have the 4 views like this. But anyway, that's kind of an interesting thing to do. I'm do a Control Alt Q and toggle back to my full screen, and do a Control Up arrow and get back to my main setup here. Okay, let's look at the 3D interface a little bit, just to get an idea how you move around in Blender. So I'm going to get the double arrow on the middle here and just drag these menus over here, just so we can have a little bit of a working space here. And in order to move around in Blender, I'm going to say that you definitely want a 3-button mouse. You can use Blender without it, but it's kind of a pain. So you want a 3-button mouse, and especially with a mouse wheel, because the mouse wheel will allow you to zoom in and out. And also, if you push down the middle button or the mouse wheel, you can do this kind of dollying around the scene like this, which is absolutely necessary when working in Blender, and especially when doing modeling. The other thing that you can do is, if you're looking at a certain area of your model, you can hold down the Shift key and your middle button on the mouse, and you can pan around the scene. Also, extremely useful. So those are the 2 major movements as far as moving around in the interface. And then of course we've already changed, or at least I did, the left button selection, so I can select a lamp or zoom out and select the camera or select my cube again. Now depending on what kind of window you have open, you'll have different options at the bottom. So for example, if I chose timeline, of course you'll see the different options that pertain to that function. So if I go back to my 3D view window, I have these kind of options available to me. Now I'm just going to go over a few of these. I'm not going to get into modeling because I have an entire 10 or 11 part course on YouTube for modeling, for basic modeling, learning 3D modeling in Blender. So just to have you somewhat of aware of the interface part of it, right now we are in object mode. You also have these different types of modes, such as edit mode, sculpt mode, vertex, weight, paint, texture paint, and there's also common shortcuts to a lot of that. So I chose the tab key, it would bring me into the editing mode, and tab key again brings me back to object mode. We also have this shading menu here. So if I chose that, you can see we have different ways of looking at our object in our viewport, such as wireframe, solid, texture, material, and rendered. Also keyboard shortcuts. I know that Z is wireframe, so it'll show us the wireframe there, and Z will toggle back. Shift Z will show the rendered view. So right now, if I did an F12 render, this is pretty much what we would see as far as getting a render of our cube, as long as our camera was pointing, right at this cube. The nice thing about the rendered view, and that is right here under viewport shading, rendered view, is you can get a real-time look of how your model is rendering out. So right now, it's not rendering out very much quality, but I can adjust that if I want to see what kind of render preview I'm getting. And I'm going to do a Shift Z and get back to our normal solid view, which is right here. Same thing. And just a word about the manipulator here. You'll see we have our Z or Z axis, our Y and our X. We can grab the manipulator and we can move our object however we need to. We can also do things with shortcuts like GY, which will move along the axis. The G is the move function in Blender. R is rotate. So I can freely rotate at whatever axis view I'm looking at right here, or I can say RZ, and I can rotate around the Z axis or Z axis. And I can also do an S, which is scale, and scale my object up and down by pulling the mouse. And I can also do an SX to only scale along the X axis. So those are just some of the functions that you can do within the modeling. Like I said, I'm not going to get into modeling because I have a whole course on that, but just to give you an idea of how this works in the interface. And while we're looking at the 3D view, you may notice this red and white circle here and wonder what the heck is that? Because when I first started Blender, it kept getting in the way. I'd right click and move it around and wondering what the heck that thing is. And a lot of people do that as well because at first it doesn't seem to really perform any function. What really is it good for? Well, I'm going to tell you what it's good for. It's actually the origin point of creating objects in Blender. So if I put it over here and I came down to my add menu and went into mesh and chose to create a sphere, I could come in here and say create UV sphere. It would create it right around that 3D cursor. But by default, you want to keep that in the center. So I'm going to do a Shift S and I'm going to choose cursor to center, and that puts it right back in the center there. And while this sphere is selected, I'm going to choose X, which is delete, and delete that sphere. I can also delete my cube here, X delete, and delete that. Okay, I'm going to choose 7 top view to get back into my top view here. And I'm going to take these menus and I'm going to drag them back over so I get my normal look here. And let me go ahead and do a Shift A, and this is another keyboard shortcut. I'm going to go to mesh and create the cube again, just so I'll have an object here that we can use as a reference. Because like I said, I'm going to go over all these options in your preferences here. So let me drag this out a little bit so we can see what's going on. So to start out with, we have our render settings, And I'm going to go through this in more detail in a little bit, but basically all the settings you need in order to create your renders. Come over here, we have our scene settings. This is where you can create render layers, and that becomes important when you set up a scene with multiple layers in it. And to tell you the truth, I didn't really get into that until I'd used Blender for probably a couple of years. So I wouldn't worry too much about this, but just be aware that you can create render layers in your scene. Come over here and we have the scene settings here. I'm sorry, I think I call these scene settings, but this is actually the render layers settings. Scene settings, you have different options here. What I've used here mostly is to change over to metric units or imperial units in case you're doing an actual scale model or that sort of thing. And then if you go across, you have world settings. You can change your world background color, the type of sky it is, and different options here for your lighting. We also have this object data menu, or the object menu. I really don't find the need to come in here too much. It has some of the same settings you'll find in different menus. We also have a constraints menu. So say, for example, if you created a model robot and you only want the arm to move 45 degrees, you might put an object constraint on it and choose to limit the rotation on it. So this is your constraint menu. You have a lot of different options there. And then you have your modifiers menu. This is very important in Blender. What it does is it adds an added level of functionality or enhancement to your objects. So if we choose to add modifier, we have all these options. And what these are is mainly, you could think of them as commonly used options, which just makes your creating of your objects easier. So say, for example, if I chose array, I'm going to start creating an array of this cube. And I can add the number of cubes that I want in there. I can change the relative offset so I can see a space in between them. And the thing about the modifiers is you can do this sort of thing, make this sort of change, and it's not permanent. It's a non-destructive way in order to change your objects. So I had this modifier here and I can see what it's doing and I can see if I like that. If I don't, I can just exit out. If I do like it and I want to keep it permanently, I can apply it. I can also turn it off visually just by clicking on that. I can also turn it off on the render if I don't want it to show up in the final render. So these are just extremely helpful items here. And as you learn Blender, as you go along in Blender, you'll learn what these different modifiers do and how useful they are. So I'm going to go ahead and X this out for now. Then we have an object data menu. And this I haven't really used too much, but I have created vertex groups, and I have used this to create objects that are meshes that are linked together so that if I change one, it also does the same action on the other. But that's, as you learn Blender and go further in Blender, is something that you may get into or you may never even need it. So then next we have the materials menu. And of course, this is very important when you're creating new materials. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn on the cycles render engine here because when you're learning Blender, probably most of the tutorials that you look at is going to be using the cycles render. So over here in materials, I'm going to choose new material. And by default, you might see an option here that says use nodes. If you do, just click on that and it'll use nodes in order to create what you're doing. But you can click on preview to see what your material is looking like. Right now it's pretty plain. You can come in here and you can change the name of your material. You can say, okay, I want this to be glass. And I can come down here and change the surface. Click on diffuse. By default, it's a diffuse surface, but I can change it to glass. So when I do that, you'll see it turns into glass and you have some options that are appropriate for glass. And remember I talked about the nodes options. We go in here and go into the node editor, and I'm just going to choose N to get rid of that menu. You'll see that you have these things called nodes. Basically what we have here is we have a glass input and we have a material output that is making what you're seeing here. We also have these same options in the nodes that we can change up here. Now the node editor itself is a learning process. You definitely, if you get into creating materials, you'll want to take some tutorials on the node editor. At least for me, it wasn't very intuitive. I still struggle with it sometimes, or actually a lot of the time, but at least as I've gone along, it's making more and more sense to me as I learn more and more about it. So I'm going to change this back to 3D view, and we can change the color of our object here. So I'm just going to make this a little bit blue, kind of a blue like glass. And if we bring down the settings here, scroll down here, you also see that you have a viewport color. Now the viewport color is strictly what you're seeing in the viewport. It has nothing to do with the color of the object as far as, the final render or anything. It's for your reference only. So I can change this and I can say, well, I want this to be green because I want all these things that I've created that are green to stand out. But like I said, it's just for your reference. It has nothing to do with the final render. So that's the material options. We go over here, we have texture options, and you can choose new texture, create different types of textures here. Now these are the built-in textures in Blender. Of course, if you get into creating your own textures, you would do it through creating UV mapping and creating your own textures. But again, as you move through creating things in this menu, you're really creating a bunch of nodes that would show up in the node editor. Now as we go along, we'll see that we have a particles menu here, our options. So I could choose new and create a particle system. And when you think of particle systems, you could think of a number of items that affect your objects. So for example, if you're creating, let's say pebbles on a beach, you could create a pebble and make it kind of unique the way you want it. And then you can use the particle system to duplicate these pebbles, make a bunch of particles that will be randomized and basically save you a lot of work in creating, hundreds of pebbles. So you can use either an emitter type or a hair type. And you'll notice when I choose hair, now all of a sudden I have a bunch of what is supposed to be hair on here. If I go to the rendered view, it might look a little bit more like hair. But you have a lot of options here that you can tweak for hair. When you think of hair, you don't always think about human hair. It could be human hair, it could be animal hair. It could also be things like rugs. Anything that might have a strand or strands coming from it is what is taken care of with the hair system there. So I'm just going to go ahead and minus out this particle system. And just be aware that that is where you create your particle systems. And the last thing we have here is physics. And when you think of physics, you think of things like you could take this cube, and if you're doing animation on it, maybe you want it to come down and react a certain way. Instead of animating the entire process, you may want it to hit wherever you say the ground is and kind of bump. And that has to do with the gravity of the object. You can do things like fluid, smoke, all of that that you do in Blender has to do with your physics functions. Okay, so those are the main options you have here. I'm going to tell you right now that you don't have to worry, at least in the beginning, on all of these. The main things is going to be your render menu, your world settings, your modifiers, your materials, and then maybe the texture or maybe a particle and physics settings, depending on what you get into. So there's really only a few things that you need to worry about there just starting out. And of course, render settings being one of the main ones. And like I said, you'll notice that when you select a different object like a lamp, you might have different options over here. So now you have these lamp options. You can click on that and you can change the type of lamp. You can say use nodes. By default, it's an emission, which in Blender is a lamp. And you can change the color and the strength and all of that in here. If you choose the camera, then you have now camera options, and you can change any needed camera options you have here. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to do a final render of an object in a scene. because I don't think it's really fair to do this kind of tutorial and then not show you how to get an output out of Blender. We've seen all the options here that we have, but how do you actually get Blender to do something? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this cube, choose X, delete the cube, and I'm going to choose Shift A, go to Mesh, and I'm going to create a UV sphere. And let's go ahead and just pull this sphere up like so, just like it's sitting right on that plane there, or right on the grid. And by the way, before I go any further, there's a couple more menus that I kind of forgot here that I do want to tell you about, and that is the T and N menus. The T is for tool shelf. So you'll see a number of tools that you have here. As we go down these menus here, we have tools such as translate, rotate, scale, mirror, all that. For my object here, I'm going to choose the smooth shading, and it just causes the shading to be smooth there on my object. And again, a lot of the things that you see here can also be done with shortcut keys. We have a create menu. This is where you can do the same thing I did with the Shift A or the add menu down at the bottom. Create your primitives. We have a relations menu, which has to do with creating new groups, setting parents and things like that. Animation menu, where you can insert or remove keyframes. A physics menu, which has to do with working with your physics. And we also have a grease pencil menu, where you can actually choose draw and start drawing with your grease pencil to make notes or outline something or erase it, whatever you want to do there. Grease pencil is pretty nice. You can even actually animate the grease pencil, which is interesting. So I'm going to go back up to tools and choose T to toggle off that menu. We also have an in menu. You can think of this as the properties menu or a properties menu. And this has to do with the properties of the object you have selected here. So as you can see, it changes as you select different objects. And you can see things like the location of your object, the rotation and scale, dimensions, different things like that. You can use the lock to lock those in if you need to. You also have the grease pencil options where you can create new grease pencils, change the color, that sort of thing. We have background images are here. So if you were modeling against a background image, this is how you would set it up using this option here. You also see the screencast keys here, which is what I'm using in order for you to see my keystrokes. This is something that I enabled in the preferences menu, and this is where it showed up so that I can change those options. So I'm going to choose N to toggle back that menu. Okay, so let's go ahead and get back to creating our render here. So what do you need in Blender in order to create a render? Well, you need something to render, which is going to be the sphere. And you need lighting, and you need the camera setup. And a lot of times you also want to have a backdrop in your scene, because if we just take a render of this sphere, the light that we have is going to pass, right through the grid, and there's nothing really to bounce off of it. There's no way to create shadows, so it's going to look pretty boring. In fact, if I do a Shift Z, this is pretty much what it's going to look like, just a sphere out there in space. So I'm going to do Shift Z to toggle back out of that. I'm going to do a Shift A, go to Mesh, create a plane, choose S to scale, and I'm just going to scale this way up, just so we have something that is underneath the sphere that we can get some interesting light to bounce off of. So now if we do a Shift Z, you can see that we now have a shadow there, which is getting kind of interesting. So I'm going to choose Shift Z, get back to our normal solid view, and I'm going to choose the lamp, come over to my lamp settings. By default, it's a point lamp. I'm going to change this to a sun, and you can choose R to rotate around the sun if you need to, but I'm going to leave it just as it is. I'm going to change the strength to something like 2 and do a Shift Z, and you can see that we have something a little bit more interesting going on here. Go Shift Z, get back to that. Now I'm going to choose my sphere. I'm going to go to materials. Remember, we created a glass material, so I'm just going to drop this down and look for my material that I created. Choose that, and now I have my glass material applied to this object. So now if I do a Shift Z, my preview window, I can see it's getting even more interesting. So Shift Z back out of that. Okay, so now we have our lamp set up, we have our object, we have something to take a render of. Now we need to set up our camera. So I'm going to choose the camera, and the easiest way to do this is use one of these other windows. So I'm just going to pull this window out here, just move my mouse over to this window, and I'm going to choose Control 0 while the camera is selected. And that way I am seeing exactly what the camera is seeing. So that's kind of a nice way to see, you know, what kind of render you're going to get. So what I'm going to do, come back to this window, choose 7 top view, and you can choose G to move your camera around. You can rotate it too if you need to, R to rotate. And you can also do a GZZ, which will move you in and out along the camera's plane that it's facing, which is very useful. You can also do all of that in this window over here. So if I choose R, I can rotate. If I choose G, I can move around and that sort of thing. So again, I can choose a Shift Z to get kind of a preview of what I'm seeing here. So I don't like the fact that I'm not seeing, you know, this background plane is not covering my image here. So I may want to take it and just choose it and choose G and just move it out. Or I can also choose S to scale it, just make it kind of infinitely large there so it's covering the entire scene. Okay, so now we have everything that we need set up in order to take a render of our scene, except our render settings. We need to go through these. So you should have changed your engine over to Cycles Render, and then choose your render settings over here. And there's a few things that we need to look at here. If you don't have an NVIDIA card, you can leave this as CPU. If you do have an NVIDIA card with the CUDA compatibility, you want to drop this down and choose GPU Compute. This tells Blender to use your graphics processing unit, onboard processor on your graphics card in order to render out the scene. It also does the previews, which makes it a lot faster. So you can see as I move around, it's actually rendering this out a lot faster. Okay, more settings we need to look at is the resolution. By default, we have 920 by 1080. I'm going to change that to 1280 by 720. And I'm just tabbing through these. I want it to do 100% of the resolution. Now, why would you have a different percentage on the resolution? Well, let's say that you had a huge resolution and you wanted to do a test render. Well, bumping this way down is an easy way to do a quicker render to see what it would look like before you do the full resolution. Okay, some other things we need to look at here. Now that we've turned on Cycles Render, we'll have this setting called Sampling. If we drop that down, you'll see we have the render sampling and we have the preview sampling. Now by default, preview is at 10. So if I change this to 100, you can see as I'm moving this around, it's taking longer in order to render this out. And if I move this over further, you can actually see the number of samples it's taking. So you can also see it's a lot more quality there once it gets done with 100 samples. The higher number of samples, the better quality you're going to get. Just be aware that there's a certain point where it doesn't make any sense to go any higher because of the amount of time it takes. So I'm going to change this back to 10, but I'm going to change my render settings to 300 because I want my final render to be fairly high. You know, it's a simple scene, so it's not going to need to be that great, but 300 will give us a nice sample. Another thing we can look at here is our performance. Drop this down, and I usually just change these tiles to 128 by 128. That seems to be a good middle of the road type of number for these tiles, and that has to do with the resolution of the tiles as they're being rendered. Okay, so now we got all our render settings set up. I'm going to move this over a little bit, move this over a little bit, and I'm going to go ahead and come over to File, and I'm going to save startup file again since I've changed so many options. Now, right now, when you open Blender again, you'll have this sphere in there, but it's not a big deal. You can always delete the sphere, or you can delete the sphere and change your, save your settings again later on. So in order to do a final render of this, I'm just going to choose Control Up Arrow so I'll get the full screen. You don't have to do that, but I just like to do that. And in order to render, you can choose F12 to render, and it will start to render your scene. So there you have it. Not a very complex render, quite a simple render, and of course there's a lot of things you can do to enhance this, but at least you get an idea of what you can do in order to get something back out of Blender. And if we do a Control Up Arrow, go back to our options, you can also see that you can change the options as far as save it as a PNG by default. You can also create movies if you're doing animation and that sort of thing. So finally, your first render, if you're proud of what you did, you can do a File, Save As, and this brings up that file browser window that I was talking about. And you can change it to whatever menu you want to, or in fact, if you get somewhere and you want to create a menu, you can come in here and say, type new, hit enter, and it'll say, okay, to create a directory. Yes, I want to create a directory. Come in here, and you can change this to, change the name of your blend file. I'm going to call this sphere, and then you can save as blend file, and that will save your blend file for you. If you want to save your final render, then just come down here to image, choose save as image, and you can change this to, call it sphere 1. By default, I have it set on PNG, but you can come down here to the bottom and change that to JPEG or TIFF or whatever you want there, and choose save as image. And that will save your image file. And then of course, once you've saved your blend file and you're happy with that name, you'll see if you make any changes, you have this little asterisk up there saying it needs to be saved, and you can just do a Control S like you do in a lot of normal Windows programs and hit enter, and you can quick save it that way. Okay, so that is a quick start guide to Blender. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please feel free to comment in the comments, put a like on the video, and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next video.